Hey, it's Adam Grant. I'm live here to talk a little bit about why in the world did I do a PhD and should you consider doing one? The answer, just as a preview, is no, probably not. But if you're still intrigued, stick with us and I'll try to give some thoughts that may clarify the decision or at least leave you confused at a slightly higher level than you were before. So when I was in college, I had no clue whatsoever what I wanted to do. I had ruled out a lot of different careers. I knew I was passionate about trying to understand the world. And I didn't know whether I wanted to try to understand the physical world or the social world. But pretty quickly I discovered that physics was a lot further ahead than psychology. And I thought, okay, if we could gain a better understanding of human behavior and what makes people tick, then maybe we could make the world a slightly less worse place than it was before. I really fell in love with psychology, and I learned a ton about myself and about other people, but I still had no idea whether I wanted to do that as a career or not. And then I ended up taking a class with a professor named Brian Little, who was a personality psychologist, and it completely changed the way that I saw the world. I went into class one day and discovered that there were all sorts of insights about personality that I hadn't understood before. I was an introvert, big surprise to me. I was an extremely high self-monitor. I worried all the time about what other people thought and found out that most of the time they weren't really paying attention to anyone else because they were focused on themselves. And every single class was a new opportunity to think about other people and myself in a totally different way. So I thought, what I really want to do is I want to teach. And Brian was a great example because he was extremely introverted, and yet he gave these absolutely riveting lectures where I would sit at the edge of my seat, I would think about the meaning of life, I would laugh constantly. But I still didn't know what exactly I wanted to study. I knew I loved psychology, I knew I wanted to teach, but where exactly do you do that? And then I took a class that later affectionately became known as Psych 8:30 a.m., which was a class with Richard Hackman in organizational psychology. And oftentimes in college, the entire class had gotten up just a few hours earlier, and people would sort of roll into class mostly asleep. But the class was so interesting that you forgot how tired you were for the entire session. And I started thinking about the fact that we all spend the majority of our waking hours at work, but very, very few of us actually find our jobs truly meaningful and motivating. And if we could try to fix organizations, we could help a lot of people at once, as opposed to typical clinical psychology, where people really only got help one person at a time. And I started thinking about maybe applying to grad school and doing a PhD. I went in to talk to Brian Little. We had a 30-minute meeting scheduled, and he ended up sitting down with me for over 3 hours, trying to understand what were my values, what were the questions I was most passionate about. And then I went to talk to Richard Hackman about what his career was like. And he said, well, it's pretty simple. I had all these careers that I thought about doing. I didn't know for sure if I wanted to do any of them. So instead, I became an organizational psychologist, and I lived vicariously through everything else that I thought I might want to be. So first, he wanted to be a basketball player. So he went and studied basketball teams and how to make them more effective. Then he said, I always wanted to be an airline pilot. And he spent several years studying cockpit crews and how to make them safer and more effective. He had always dreamed of being a conductor in an orchestra. And he went and studied orchestras around the world to try to figure out what would make great music and how do you bring a whole group of people together so that they're more than the sum of the parts, as opposed to less. And then he had kind of toyed with the idea for a while of being an intelligence agent. So he went and studied the CIA and the NSA and tried to figure out how they could make their teams more effective. And I was just mesmerized by this because here you had a guy who was interested in one core question, which is, how do you make a group tick? And really for Richard, it was, how do you ever work well with another human being? And he was able to study that in all these different places that were endlessly fascinating to him. And I thought, that sounds really cool. If I go and become a professor and I know I'll love teaching, if I do research, then if I don't like my job, it's my own fault because I picked the questions that I wanted to study. So I ended up deciding that I was going to apply to PhD programs, and I was excited by the opportunity to teach and try to pay forward some of the great education and inspiration that I got from my own professors. I was interested in research, and I also kind of liked the idea of job security, that if I one day got tenure, no one could ever fire me, which now on the other side is occasionally a good feeling. But I was also really intrigued by the fact that there was this opportunity in social science to try to bridge the gap between what Tal Ben-Shahar calls sort of ivory tower and Main Street. And creating that kind of bridge seemed pretty exciting and pretty important. So I decided to go for it and landed at the University of Michigan and found it to just be an endlessly interesting experience where all the kinds of questions that I wondered about in my spare time anyway, and I spent a lot of my time talking with, when I was in random conversations with friends, I could actually study those for a living. What I got out of doing a PhD was pretty simple. I was able to then become a professor. I felt like I had some credibility to gather evidence about questions that I thought were interesting and meaningful. And eventually that turned into an opportunity to communicate that evidence to the broader world. But it wasn't necessarily a smooth path. When I got to grad school, I was pretty deeply depressed for the beginning of it because I arrived on day one and I found out that I wasn't allowed to teach until my third year. And the whole reason that I wanted to become a professor was because I was excited about the idea of sharing knowledge. And at first I thought maybe I should drop out. And then I realized I was studying some research by one of my advisors, Jane Dutton, and a former student of hers, Amy Resnesky. And they'd been doing this work on job crafting about how people don't just accept the jobs that are given to them. They take initiative and they find creative ways to redesign their work to make it more meaningful, to express their values, to bring their identities to the table. And I thought, well, maybe I could actually craft my role in grad school and make it something that involved teaching. So I reached out to one of my advisors, Rick Price, and I said, look, I'd like to build a mini seminar so that undergrads can learn. And he said, well, how is that going to help your research? I said, well, what we'll do is we'll make it into a research seminar where we collaborate on projects and I'll build a team of research assistants. So he agreed to sign off on 4 undergraduate students doing independent studies. I took the projects and said, okay, we're going to build teams, we're going to let these students work together, and my hope is that they'll get to learn about research, which I had a great experience doing as an undergrad. Then I went and interviewed students, and I had a big problem, which was I found way more students that I wanted to take than I had slots. And I ended up accepting 10 students instead of 4. I had to convince Rick that that was not a terrible idea. But once I brought them together, we were working on research projects, but we also met weekly to read articles and talk about them and generate new ideas, and it actually felt like I was teaching. So yeah, I had to go rogue a little bit, but that was one of the ways that I overcame the misery of the first 2 years of grad school. There were some other things that I found really challenging. One was just constant rejection. I started submitting papers because I wanted to share my ideas and I wanted to try to get some new studies out there. And more often than not, they were not only shot down, I was told that I should reconsider this career path and maybe never do research again. And that was pretty discouraging at first. I had one person that I reached out to who took a look at the projects that I was involved in. And he said, if you get even half of these published, then this is like a decade worth of work. And you should cut most of your projects. And I was sort of taken aback that somebody who hardly knew me could judge what I was capable of. And I made it my mission to spend the rest of grad school trying to prove this guy wrong. And I'm not sure if I ever succeeded at that. But it took a lot of rejections before I finally got my first acceptance. I submitted my first paper, it was rejected. Second paper was rejected. Third was rejected. I submitted more than a dozen papers and they were all shot down by journals. But every single rejection that I got was a chance to learn something from reviewers who are extremely experienced in the field. And that gave me a chance to take a step back and say, what are the common patterns? What am I doing wrong in each of these papers, and how can I learn to get better at this? And eventually, I finally got my first invitation to revise and resubmit a paper. And at that point, I had suffered through so many rejections that this gave me a sense of hope, and I decided to stick with it. The one other thing that I found really difficult in grad school was not having a boss. I felt like there were so many exciting questions that I could take on that I never really knew when to stop working, and I ended up doing a lot more work than I intended to. And there were days that I wished that somebody would just say, you know, you kind of finished all your projects today. You can go home. And that never happened. And I had to really force myself to hit the pause button and set some boundaries, which is something that I didn't really figure out until my wife and I had kids. And it's a lot easier now because I never want to sacrifice family time for work. And that means I try to get almost all my work done when our kids are either at school or asleep. And before that, it was a little bit more difficult to know when I shouldn't be working. So for those of you who are thinking about maybe doing PhDs one day, why should you do it? I think the best reason to do it is if you want to become a professor, because there aren't a lot of professor jobs that allow you to not have that degree. If you don't want to be a professor, I think a PhD is usually a mistake because you spend a ton of time learning how to produce research, how to do statistical analyses if you're in the social sciences like I am, how to publish your work for academics, and a lot of that training is not relevant to work in the practical world. So I often discourage people if they're thinking about being in an applied role from actually going down the PhD route. I think there is, though, growing interest from companies in the kind of work that we do in organizational psychology, in people analytics, and I think we may see more programs crop up that are designed to teach people to do applied research as opposed to just basic research. But I think it's worth asking, if you're thinking about a PhD, why do you really want to do one? What's the motivation behind it? One of the things that I notice when students come into office hours and they say, I'm considering this path, is this something I should do or not? Is some of them will say, I can't decide, should I get my PhD? And I'm always struck when people say, my PhD. It's like Ross from Friends, if you ever saw it, my sandwich. But when you say my PhD, it gives me the sense, as I ask more questions, that you're really more excited about having done a PhD than actually going through the work of learning and getting one. It's like Mark Twain said of a classic, right? A classic is a book that everyone wants to have read, but nobody wants to read. And I think that, unfortunately, a lot of times when people take a strong sense of ownership of the idea that I need to have this advanced degree, they haven't thought that carefully about, am I going to enjoy the process of reading these esoteric articles in journals? And one of my favorite tests that I give to students at that point is, I'll say, look, take a journal in the field that you're considering, and your job is to open it up, read the 3 most interesting articles to you in that journal. And if you are still awake, drop what you're doing and get into a PhD program now. Because most people cannot make it through the first 2 sentences of the first article that they look at because they're so dull. And if you're interested enough in the work that you can suffer through awful writing and a lot of information that you haven't yet been taught how to really understand, then I think that's a pretty promising sign. But there's some great advice that a colleague of mine has given pretty frequently that I think adds to that picture, which is, this is from Alison Fergale at UNC. Alison often says, if you're thinking about doing a PhD and there's anything else that you're excited to do, you should go and do that instead. Because chances are that other thing is not a 5-6 year commitment. It's also going to actually make sure that you have a salary and a job and an opportunity to do something with your life. And a PhD is a pretty good route for people who feel strongly that they have burning questions that they absolutely have to pursue, and also are pretty jazzed about the idea of being in the classroom and connecting with students. I think the last question to think about if you're considering doing a PhD is, how much do you really love the process of producing research as opposed to just consuming it? Thanks to so many public intellectuals, we now have much more access to great ideas than we did even a decade ago. I remember as a freshman in college, I took a writing class on influence my very first semester. And one of the books that was assigned was a book called Influence by Robert Cialdini. And it took social psychology and showed how it could be used as a weapon of persuasion. But more importantly, for somebody like me who always got taken advantage of, it was a set of tools to know when other people were about to exploit me. And it gave me some great ideas about how to defend myself. And I loved that book so much that I had it assigned for 2 other classes that year, and I reread it both times. I know my roommates and my parents and some of my friends got really tired of me quoting research all the time. And I knew at that point that I was fascinated by these kinds of studies. I then read The Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell, and was even more excited about learning about this research. But I still didn't know, did I actually like doing research? I had a professor, Ellen Langer, who at the end of my freshman year of college invited me to join her research lab. I literally didn't know what research was at that point. I thought that basically professors just taught, and it didn't occur to me that they had spent so much time actually generating knowledge as opposed to just communicating it. So I joined her lab and found that I really liked the process of doing research. And then started working with a couple other professors. I ended up doing a thesis of my own, and that was when I really got hooked, because I got to pick the question. I got to go out into the world and study an organization and try to figure out how were individuals and teams succeeding in the face of extreme difficulties, and what caused some to be really effective and others to fail flat. And that was the moment that I thought, okay, the idea of doing research is for me. I remember as a senior in college getting my first thesis data in and waking up several hours earlier than I had any time in weeks, just because I was itching to get into the data and figure out what I actually found. And if you find yourself that curious about understanding a question, then I think a PhD is probably not a bad idea for you. But the fit with the field that you're doing is extremely important, because there are lots of other fields I think I would have hated doing a PhD in, where the methods of research and the kinds of questions that they look at aren't as interesting to me. Even when I look at fields that are related to organizational psychology, like sociology or economics, the questions just aren't quite as captivating to me. And some of the methods, although the fields have started to converge, are just not as much of a fit with the kinds of questions that I find myself interested in looking at. I thought the coolest thing about psychology by far was that I could go into organizations, I could design experiments to try to figure out if we could boost motivation, if we could increase job performance, if we could help people find more meaningful work. And we could actually use the scientific method to figure out, are we making a difference here? Can we design some small changes that would have a real lasting impact? And so that made the field that I chose a great fit for me. So if you end up going into a PhD program, I think the best advice that I could offer is make sure that you end up living in what's called Pasteur's quadrant. This is from a book by Donald Stokes, who said there's always a fight between basic and applied research in any field. And the basic scientists kind of look down their noses at the applied researchers and say, look, you're not doing true research, you're not solving fundamental problems. And then the applied researchers have a similar reaction to the basic people. And they say, I don't know why you do that work. Those questions don't matter. How is this going to have any influence on the world whatsoever? What Stokes argued in this book is that this is a false dichotomy, that you don't have basic and applied research at the opposite ends of one continuum. In fact, they're two separate axes. And if you draw the 2 by 2, the future of learning, of thinking, of scholarship is really in the high cell, where you do basic research that answers fundamental questions, and you do applied work that contributes to practice and solves real problems. And Stokes called it Pasteur's quadrant because he said, look, Louis Pasteur was such a perfect example of this. He fundamentally changed our understanding of biology by helping to pioneer germ theory, but he also solved some pretty practical problems like pasteurizing milk. And I think that's a powerful model that every scientist might want to aspire to. The other thing I would say is I think that unfortunately we have so many disciplines that create walls and borders between them. We've known since the 1960s, when Donald Campbell did some of his great work, that the most creative insights actually happen at the boundaries between disciplines. So to the extent that you're excited about a question, if you can engage different ways of thinking, multiple perspectives for learning, you've got a much better shot at doing something that's exciting and new and different than what existed before. So I hope a few of these thoughts have been helpful. I'll be back again soon live, and I thank some of you for joining today.